Nobody was supposed to survive that room. The walls were scorched black. The floor was cracked and melted. Every soldier who had walked through that door before him had never walked back out. The galaxy's most dangerous creature was locked inside, and the people in charge had run out of options. So they sent a medic. Not a warrior, not a general, not some legendary fighter with 100 kills on his record. They sent the one man on the ship who was trained to save lives, not take them. And what happened next was so unbelievable, so completely impossible, that the people who witnessed it refused to talk about it for years. This is the story they buried. This is the story that changed everything. In this video, you are going to discover 3 things that will completely blow your mind. First, you will find out why the most deadly dragon in the entire galaxy was impossible to control, and why every attempt to stop it had failed. Second, you will learn what one human medic did inside that room that no soldier, no weapon, and no technology could ever do. And third, you will uncover the truth about what really happened after that day, and why the people in power tried so hard to make sure nobody ever found out. This is not just a story about a dragon. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful forces in the universe underestimate a single human being. Stay with me, because this story starts in the darkest corner of the galaxy, in a place where hope had already died, and where one ordinary man was about to do something that nobody, not even he, could fully explain. Let me show you exactly how this happened. His name was Sergeant Daniel Hale. He was not famous. He was not decorated with medals or celebrated in the halls of the Galactic Medical Corps. He was just a man who showed up every single day, did his job, and went to sleep knowing he had kept at least one more person alive. That was enough for him. That had always been enough. Daniel was 43 years old. He had a short gray beard that he never quite managed to shave, clean dark hair that was starting to thin at the temples, and eyes that had seen too much to ever look truly rested. He had served on 6 different ships across 4 different star systems. He had patched up soldiers after battles that should have killed them all. He had held the hands of men and women who were taking their last breath and made sure they did not die alone. He was good at his job. Quietly, consistently, without any need for recognition, he was one of the best combat medics in the entire fleet. But nobody talked about Daniel Hale. Not until the day they locked him in that room. The ship was called the Vanguard Eternal. It was one of the largest military vessels in the Galactic Coalition fleet, a massive steel city floating through the dark between stars. It carried over 4,000 crew members, enough weapons to level a small planet, and enough medical staff to run a full hospital. It was supposed to be unstoppable. And for most of its service history, it was. But 3 weeks before Daniel's story truly began, something changed. Something was brought aboard the Vanguard Eternal that nobody had ever dealt with before. Something that made even the most experienced commanders go quiet when they talked about it in private. They called it Krath. Nobody knew exactly where Krath had come from. The official reports said it had been captured on a remote moon in the outer rim of the Draconis sector, a region of space that most ships avoided because the gravitational fields were unstable and the communication signals were unreliable. A small reconnaissance team had found it there, alone, in the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient structure. The structure itself was thousands of years old. Nobody knew who had built it. Nobody knew why Krath had been there. What they did know was that Krath was unlike anything the galaxy had ever recorded. It was a dragon. Not a metaphor, not a nickname, not a classification code. An actual dragon. Massive, scaled, winged, with a body that stretched nearly 30 meters from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail. Its scales were a deep, burning crimson, the color of fresh blood under a red sun. Its eyes glowed with a light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside it. A pulsing, furious red that never dimmed, not even when it slept. Its horns were long and jagged, curving back from its skull like broken blades. Its claws were each the length of a grown man's arm. And it breathed fire. Not the chemical fire that some creatures in the outer systems could produce. Real fire. Ancient fire. The kind of fire that burned through metal and stone, and left nothing behind but ash and silence. The reconnaissance team had made a mistake. They had thought they could contain it. They had used every restraint system they had, every sedative compound in their medical kit, every energy barrier their equipment could generate, and for about 6 hours it had worked. Then Krath woke up. 2 members of the team did not survive. The other 3 escaped with injuries that would take months to heal. The ship they had arrived in was destroyed. And Krath somehow was still contained, not because of anything the team had done, but because it seemed to choose to stay. As if it was waiting for something. Nobody understood that part. Nobody wanted to think about it too hard. By the time Krath was transferred to the Vanguard Eternal, the Galactic Coalition had already lost 11 soldiers trying to study it, move it, and understand it. The creature had destroyed 3 separate containment units. It had survived direct hits from weapons that could crack the hull of a warship. It had not eaten anything in 3 weeks, had not slept for more than a few hours at a time, and showed no signs of weakening. The scientists on board were terrified. The commanders were frustrated, and the soldiers who were assigned to guard the containment bay where Krath was being held had started requesting transfers in numbers that were becoming impossible to ignore. The containment bay itself was on the lowest level of the ship, deep in the hull where the walls were thickest and the distance from the rest of the crew was greatest. It had been reinforced 3 times since Krath arrived. The energy barriers were running at maximum capacity around the clock. The temperature inside the bay had risen so high from Krath's body heat that the monitoring equipment had to be replaced twice because it kept melting. And still, every few hours, Krath would test the barriers. Not frantically, not desperately, but slowly, methodically, as if it was learning, as if it was studying the walls the same way the scientists were studying it. That was the part that scared people the most. It was not the fire. It was not the size. It was the intelligence behind those glowing red eyes. The way it watched. The way it seemed to understand more than it should. The way it never made a sound unless it wanted to. And when it did make a sound, the vibration traveled through the entire ship and made every single person on board feel, for just a moment, like they were very small and very alone. Daniel Hale had heard about Krath, of course. Everyone on the ship had. But his job was in the medical bay on level 7, 3 full decks above the containment unit, and he had more than enough work to keep him busy, without worrying about a dragon he was never going to see. He was treating a young soldier named Corporal Yemi Adeyemi when the announcement came through. Yemi had a fractured wrist from a training accident, and was sitting on the examination table looking embarrassed about it when the ship-wide communication system clicked on. The voice that came through was calm, the way voices are calm when the person speaking is working very hard to sound calm. All senior medical staff report to command level immediately. This is not a drill. Daniel looked at Yemi. Yemi looked at Daniel. Finish wrapping that, Daniel said, nodding at the bandage. You know how to do it. I showed you last time. He was already moving toward the door. The walk to command level took 4 minutes. By the time Daniel arrived, there were already a dozen people in the room, standing around a central display table that was showing a live feed from the containment bay. The image on the screen was grainy and flickering, because the heat from Krath's body kept interfering with the cameras, but it was clear enough. Krath was not moving. It was sitting in the center of the bay, perfectly still, its massive head lowered, its eyes half closed. It looked almost peaceful, but the readings on the display told a different story. It's sick, said Dr. Priya Okafor, the ship's chief medical officer. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a voice that did not waste words. She was pointing at a series of biological readings on the screen. These thermal signatures are wrong. The energy output has dropped by 40% in the last 6 hours. The respiratory pattern is irregular. Something is wrong with it. Good, said Commander Voss. He was a large man with a square jaw, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about anything important. Let it get sick. Let it die. Problem solved. It's not that simple, Dr. Okafor said. If Krath dies inside that containment unit, the biological reaction from a creature of this size and energy level could be catastrophic. We don't know what it's made of. We don't know what happens when something like this dies. The last time a creature with this energy signature expired in a contained space, it took out half a research station. The room went quiet. "So what are you suggesting?" Commander Voss asked. "I'm suggesting we send someone in to assess the situation. A medical professional. Someone who can get close enough to take readings without provoking it. Every soldier we've sent near that thing has ended up in your medical bay," Voss said. "Or worse. Soldiers provoke it," Dr. Okafor said. "They go in armored, ready to fight. Krath responds to aggression with aggression. We need someone who goes in without weapons, without armor, someone it won't see as a threat." Another silence. Longer this time. Daniel was standing near the back of the room. He had been listening carefully, looking at the readings on the screen, watching the slow rise and fall of Krath's massive chest on the grainy camera feed. He was thinking about something. A pattern he had noticed in the biological data that nobody else seemed to be paying attention to. "I'll go," he said. Every head in the room turned toward him. Commander Voss looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something so unexpected that they need a moment to process whether it was serious. "You're a medic," Voss said. "Yes," Daniel said. "That's exactly why I should go." He walked to the display table and pointed at the respiratory readings. "Look at this pattern. I've seen this before. Not in a dragon, obviously. But the rhythm is the same. This creature is not just sick. It's in pain. Chronic, deep pain. And it's been in pain for a long time." He traced the line on the screen with his finger. "Something is wrong with it that started long before we brought it on board. We didn't cause this, but we might be making it worse." Dr. Okafor was watching him carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Daniel said slowly, "that the reason it keeps testing the barriers isn't because it wants to escape. I think it's asking for help." The room was completely silent. Outside, somewhere deep in the hull of the ship, a low vibration moved through the walls. Slow, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Commander Voss looked at Dr. Okafor. Dr. Okafor looked at Daniel. And Daniel looked at the screen, at the creature that had destroyed everything anyone had ever sent against it, lying still and quiet in the dark. "All right," Voss said finally. His voice was flat. "But if it kills you, Hale, I want it on record that I thought this was a terrible idea." Daniel nodded. "Noted," he said. He turned and walked toward the door. He had no weapons, no armor, no plan beyond what his instincts and his training were telling him. He had a medical kit, a calm voice, and 43 years of knowing how to walk into a room where something was suffering and make it feel, even just for a moment, like it was not completely alone. That was all he had. And somehow, impossibly, it was going to be enough. The corridor leading to the containment bay was the loneliest place Daniel had ever walked. It was long and narrow, lit by emergency strips along the floor, because the overhead lights had been damaged by the heat. The walls were warm to the touch. The air smelled like something ancient, like stone and smoke, and something else that Daniel could not name. Something that made the back of his throat tighten and his pulse move a little faster than he wanted it to. He walked slowly, not because he was afraid, though he was. He walked slowly because he was thinking. He had spent the last 20 minutes reviewing every piece of data the science team had collected on Krath since it came aboard. He had read the field reports from the reconnaissance team that found it. He had looked at the biological scans, the thermal readings, the behavioral logs. He had paid particular attention to the moments when Krath had been calm, and the moments when it had not, and he had tried to find the pattern. There was always a pattern. That was something Daniel believed deeply. Something his first mentor in the medical corps had told him on his very first day of training. Every patient tells you what they need. You just have to learn how to listen. He had listened to a lot of patients over the years. Humans, mostly, but also a handful of other species he had encountered during his service. A Valhari soldier with a respiratory infection that his species had never developed immunity to. A Keth engineer with a bone fracture that healed differently than human bone. A young Praxian girl who had been so frightened of medical equipment that she had refused treatment until Daniel had sat on the floor beside her and talked to her for an hour about nothing in particular. Just talked. Until she stopped shaking. He thought about that girl now as he walked. He thought about what it felt like to be in pain and not be able to explain it. to be surrounded by people who were either afraid of you or trying to control you, and to have no way of making them understand that all you needed was for someone to just stop and listen. The door to the containment bay was a massive slab of reinforced alloy, 3 feet thick, with a locking mechanism that required 2 separate authorization codes and a biometric scan to open. There were 2 guards stationed outside it. They looked at Daniel the way people look at someone walking toward something they should be running away from. "You sure about this, Sergeant?" one of them asked. His name tag said Torres. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that still showed everything he was feeling. "No," Daniel said honestly. "Open the door." Torres hesitated for just a moment. Then he entered his code. The door opened slowly, with a sound like the whole ship exhaling. The heat hit Daniel first. It was not the sharp, burning heat of an open flame. It was deep and heavy. The kind of heat that pressed against your skin and seeped into your bones. The air inside the bay shimmered slightly. The walls were dark with scorch marks and patterns that told the story of every time Krath had tested the barriers. And there, in the center of the bay, was Krath. It was bigger than Daniel had expected. Even knowing the measurements, even having seen the camera feeds, nothing had prepared him for the reality of standing in the same room as something that large. Krath's head alone was bigger than Daniel's entire body. Its wings were folded against its sides, but even folded they stretched nearly the full width of the bay. Its tail curled around its body like a wall. It was not moving. Its eyes were open, though. Those deep, glowing red eyes were fixed on Daniel the moment he stepped through the door, not with aggression, not with the wild, furious energy that the behavioral logs had described. With something else. Something that Daniel recognized, though he had never expected to see it in a creature like this. Exhaustion. Daniel stood still. He did not move toward Krath. He did not raise his hands or make any gesture. He just stood there, in the doorway, and let the creature look at him. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Krath did not move. Daniel took one slow step forward, then stopped. Then waited. Nothing. Another step. Stop. Wait. He did this for 10 minutes, one step at a time, with long pauses between each one, moving across the bay floor with the same patience he used when approaching a patient who was frightened and in pain. Not rushing, not forcing, just being present, and letting the creature decide what it wanted to do with that presence. By the time he was close enough to see the individual scales on Krath's chest, he had been in the bay for nearly 15 minutes. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His heart was beating hard enough that he could feel it in his fingertips. But his face was calm. His breathing was slow and even. He had learned a long time ago that the body takes cues from the face, and the face takes cues from the decision you make about what you are going to feel. He had decided to feel calm. So he was calm. He looked at Krath's chest, at the slow, uneven rise and fall of those massive scales. He looked at the way the creature held its head, slightly lowered, slightly tilted to the left. He looked at the tension in the muscles along its neck and shoulders. And then he saw it. Just below the left shoulder, where the wing connected to the body, there was a section of scales that looked different from the rest. They were darker, slightly raised. The skin beneath them was swollen in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. An infection. Deep tissue. By the look of it. Old. Weeks old, maybe longer. Daniel exhaled slowly. There it was. He opened his medical kit. He moved carefully, deliberately, making sure every movement was visible and slow. He took out a scanner and held it up, not pointing it at Krath yet, just holding it so the creature could see it, so it could understand that this was a tool, not a weapon. Krath watched him. Those red eyes tracked every movement. But it did not move. It did not make a sound. Daniel took another step closer. He raised the scanner slowly and ran it across the area below the left shoulder. The readings came back immediately. He had been right. The infection was deep and severe, the kind that had been building for a long time without treatment. In a human patient, it would have been agonizing. In a creature this size, with this kind of biology, Daniel could only imagine what it felt like. Like carrying a fire inside your own body that you could not put out. He looked up at Krath's face. Krath was still watching him. Still perfectly still. "I see it," Daniel said quietly. He was not sure why he spoke out loud. It was not as if Krath could understand him. But it felt right. It felt like the thing to do. "I know what's wrong. And I can help you. If you let me." The silence in the bay was absolute. Then, very slowly, Krath lowered its head. Not aggressively, not as a threat. It lowered its head the way a patient leans back on an examination table. The way someone who has been in pain for a very long time finally allows themselves to stop fighting it. Daniel's hands were steady as he reached into his kit for the treatment compounds. His mind was completely focused. This was what he did. This was who he was. He got to work. On-screen cue, close-up of Daniel's hands opening medical kit, scanner glowing blue in the dim light. Whole idea, slow pan across Krath's scales, focusing on the infected area, then cut to Daniel's calm, focused expression. Part 3. Word traveled fast on a ship like the Vanguard Eternal. By the time Daniel had been inside the containment bay for 30 minutes, half the crew knew something unusual was happening. By the time an hour had passed, Commander Voss was standing outside the bay door watching the camera feed on a portable display. His arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Dr. Okafor was beside him. She had not said a word in 20 minutes. She was watching the feed with the focused intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail of something they were not sure they would ever see again. On the screen, Daniel was working. He had positioned himself beside Krath's left shoulder, close enough to treat the infected area, and Krath had not moved. It had not flinched. It had not made a sound. It was simply lying there, those massive red eyes half closed, while a human medic who came up to roughly the height of its knee worked on it with the same quiet efficiency he brought to every patient he had ever treated. "Is it sedated?" Voss asked. "No," Dr. Okafor said. "The sedative compounds we tried before had no effect on its biology. It's completely conscious." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Then why isn't it moving?" Dr. Okafor did not answer right away. She watched the screen. She watched Daniel carefully apply a compound to the infected area, watched him check his scanner readings, watched him make a small adjustment and check again. "I think," she said slowly, "it trusts him." Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It's a dragon." "Yes," Dr. Okafor said. "And it's been in pain for weeks, surrounded by people who were either afraid of it or trying to control it. And then someone walked in without a weapon and without armor and just tried to help it." She paused. "Maybe that means something. Even to a dragon." Inside the bay, Daniel was talking. Not loudly, not in any particular language that Krath could understand, just a low, steady stream of words the way he always talked to patients when he was working. Explaining what he was doing. Narrating each step, not because it was necessary, but because silence in a treatment room always made things worse, and a calm voice always made things better. "This is going to feel strange," he said, applying the second compound. "It's going to draw out the infection. It might get worse before it gets better. That's normal, that's just the process." Krath made a sound. Low, deep, resonant. It moved through the floor of the bay and up through the walls, and Daniel felt it in his chest like a second heartbeat. He paused, looked up at Krath's face. The creature's eyes were fully open now, looking directly at him. There was something in that gaze that Daniel could not fully describe. It was not the blank stare of an animal. It was not the wild fury that the behavioral logs had documented. It was something more complex than either of those things. Something that made Daniel feel, for just a moment, like he was being seen very clearly by something that understood a great deal more than it was letting on. "I know," Daniel said. "I know it hurts. But you're going to be okay." He went back to work. Outside, Commander Voss had stopped making skeptical sounds. He was just watching the screen, his arms still crossed, his expression still unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted. Something had loosened slightly. Dr. Okafor noticed. She said nothing. The treatment took 2 hours in total. Daniel worked methodically through each stage, checking his readings after every step, adjusting his approach based on what the scanner told him about how Krath's biology was responding. It was unlike any treatment he had ever performed. The scale of it, literally and figuratively, was unlike anything in his training. But the principles were the same. Find the problem. Address the cause, not just the symptoms. Be patient. Be present. Do not rush. By the time he finished, the infected area had already begun to respond. The swelling was down slightly. The thermal readings from that section of Krath's body had normalized. It would take days for the infection to fully clear, and Daniel would need to return to treat it again. But the worst of it had been addressed. He packed up his kit. He stood up slowly, his back aching from 2 hours of working in a crouched position. He looked up at Krath. Krath was watching him. Daniel nodded once. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "Same time." He turned and walked toward the door. He was almost there when he heard it. Another sound from Krath, different from the first one. Softer. Shorter. Almost like a word, though Daniel knew that was impossible. He stopped. Turned around. Krath had not moved, but its eyes were still on him. And the expression in them, if you could call it that, if you were willing to believe that a dragon could have an expression, was something that Daniel had seen before. Many times, in many different patients, in many different medical bays, across many different star systems. It was gratitude. Daniel stood there for a moment. Then he nodded again. "You're welcome," he said. He walked out. The door sealed behind him. Torres was still at his post. The young guard looked at Daniel with wide eyes, taking in the sweat-soaked shirt, the calm face, the medical kit hanging from one hand. "How did it go?" Torres asked. Daniel thought about it for a moment. "Good," he said. "It went good." He started walking back toward the medical bay. He had other patients waiting. He had work to do. But something had changed. He could feel it, though he could not yet put words to it. Something had shifted in the air of the ship, in the mood of the crew, in the way the Vanguard Eternal felt as it moved through the dark between stars. Something that had been very wrong was beginning, slowly, to become right. The next morning, Daniel returned. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. Each time, the guards at the door watched him go in with the same mixture of disbelief and something that was slowly becoming respect. Each time, Krath was waiting. Not pacing, not testing the barriers, not doing any of the things the behavioral log said it did between visits. Just waiting. Still and quiet, those red eyes turning toward the door the moment it opened. By the 4th day, the infection had cleared significantly. By the 7th day, it was almost gone. The thermal readings had normalized. The respiratory pattern had steadied. Krath was eating, which it had refused to do since coming aboard, consuming the large quantities of protein compounds the science team had been leaving in the bay and ignoring. The change in the creature was visible to everyone who watched the camera feeds. The wild, coiled tension that had defined every moment of Krath's time on the ship was gone. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to be unmistakable. Enough to make the scientists start asking questions they had not thought to ask before. Dr. Okafor requested a meeting with Commander Voss on the 8th day. "I want to propose something," she said, "and I want you to hear me out before you say no." Voss looked at her. "That's never a good opening. I want to give Hale full access to the containment bay, unrestricted. I want him to continue the treatment, obviously. But I also want to see what happens if we give this relationship room to develop." "Relationship," Voss repeated. "That's what it is," Dr. Okafor said. "Whether we understand it or not, that's what it is, and I think it might be the most important thing that has happened on this ship since we brought Krath aboard." Voss was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the camera feed on his desk display. Krath was lying in the center of the bay, calm, its eyes half closed. Daniel was not in the bay at that moment. It was the middle of the afternoon. But the creature's posture was completely different from what it had been 2 weeks ago. "What are you hoping to find?" Voss asked. "I don't know yet," Dr. Okafor said honestly. "But I think Krath is more than what we think it is. I think it came from somewhere important. I think it knows things. And I think the only person on this ship it might be willing to communicate with is Hale." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the screen. "Fine," he said. "But Hale reports to you daily. Everything gets documented. And the moment anything changes, the moment it shows any sign of aggression, we shut it down." "Agreed," Dr. Okafor said. She found Daniel in the medical bay an hour later and told him what had been decided. Daniel listened carefully. He asked a few questions. Then he nodded. "There's something I've been wanting to try," he said. "But I didn't want to push it before the infection was fully cleared." "What is it?" Dr. Okafor asked. "I want to see if it will let me touch it," Daniel said. "Not for treatment. Just contact. The way you would with any patient who has been isolated for a long time." Dr. Okafor looked at him. "You want to pet the dragon?" "I want to make contact," Daniel said carefully. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then she almost smiled. "All right," she said. "Document everything." The next morning, Daniel went to the bay as usual. He did his treatment check, confirmed that the infection was nearly gone, ran his standard scans. Krath watched him with those half-closed eyes, patient and still. When the treatment was done, Daniel did not pack up his kit and leave. He sat down, right there on the floor of the containment bay, cross-legged, his kit beside him. He sat down and looked up at Krath. Krath looked back at him. They stayed like that for a while, just existing in the same space, not doing anything, not needing to. Then Daniel slowly raised his hand, palm up, open, the universal gesture of something offered, not taken. Krath looked at his hand, then at his face, then at his hand again. Very slowly, with a deliberateness that made Daniel's breath catch, Krath lowered its massive head until its snout was level with Daniel's outstretched hand. It stopped there, close enough that Daniel could feel the heat radiating from it, close enough to see the individual scales around its nostrils moving with each breath. Daniel did not move. He kept his hand open. He kept his breathing slow. And then Krath touched its snout to his palm. Just for a moment, just a brief gentle contact. Then it lifted its head again and looked at him with those deep red eyes. Daniel exhaled. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." On the camera feed, Torres watched the whole thing with his mouth slightly open. He would tell the story later, to anyone who would listen for the rest of his life. He would describe the moment when the most dangerous creature in the galaxy touched the hand of a medic who had walked in without a weapon, and how the whole ship seemed to go quiet for just a second, as if even the engines had paused to notice. He would say it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. He was not wrong. What happened over the next 2 weeks changed everything, not just on the Vanguard Eternal, not just for the crew, for the entire galactic coalition, though most of them would not know it for a long time. Daniel spent hours in the containment bay every day. He brought his medical kit, but increasingly it stayed closed. He brought a chair, eventually, because sitting on the floor for hours was hard on his back. He brought a small data pad and took notes, not clinical notes but observations. Things he noticed, patterns in Krath's behavior, the sounds it made and what seemed to prompt them, the way it moved when it was comfortable versus when something was bothering it. He was building a language, not a spoken one, something more fundamental than that. A language of presence and response, of action and reaction, of trust, built one small moment at a time. Dr. Okafor reviewed his notes every evening. She started bringing her own data pad to their meetings, filling it with analysis and questions. The science team, initially skeptical, began requesting access to Daniel's observations. They started seeing things in the data that they had missed before, patterns in Krath's biology that only made sense when you understood that the creature had been in chronic pain since before it was captured, and that the removal of that pain had fundamentally changed how it was functioning. But it was not just the physical change that was remarkable. Krath was communicating. Not in words, not in any system that could be easily translated, but in ways that were becoming increasingly clear to Daniel, and increasingly documented in his notes. The sounds it made had patterns. The movements of its head and eyes had meaning. The way it positioned its body in relation to Daniel told a story that Daniel was slowly learning to read. On the 12th day of the expanded access period, something happened that nobody had anticipated. Daniel was sitting in his chair, reviewing his notes from the previous session, when Krath moved to the far wall of the containment bay. It stood there for a moment, then turned back to look at Daniel, then turned to the wall again. Daniel watched. "What are you showing me?" he asked. Krath pressed one massive claw against the wall. Not hard, not aggressively. Deliberately. And then it traced something. A shape. Slow and careful, the claw moving through the scorch marks on the wall like a stylus on a writing surface. Daniel stood up. He walked closer. He looked at what Krath had drawn. It was a symbol. Complex. Multi-layered. Unlike anything in any database the ship carried. But unmistakably intentional. Unmistakably meaningful. Daniel photographed it immediately and sent it to Dr. Okafor. Her response came back in under a minute. "Get the linguistics team down here now." The linguistics team spent 3 days analyzing the symbol. They cross-referenced it against every known language and symbol system in the Coalition database. They found nothing that matched exactly. But they found fragments, pieces of the symbol that appeared in ancient records from 4 different civilizations across 3 different star systems. Civilizations that had no known contact with each other. Civilizations that had existed thousands of years apart. The conclusion was impossible. And yet there it was. Krath was not just an animal. It was not just a creature that had been found on a remote moon by accident. It was something far older, far more significant, and far more connected to the history of the galaxy than anyone had imagined, and it had chosen to reveal this to a medic who had walked into its room without a weapon and asked if it needed help. Commander Voss called an emergency meeting of all senior staff. The room was full and very quiet as Dr. Okafor presented the findings. "What we are dealing with," she said, "is not a captured animal. Based on the linguistic analysis, the biological data, and the behavioral observations documented by Sergeant Hale, we believe Krath is a representative of a species that predates every known civilization in this galaxy. A species that was believed to be extinct. A species that, according to fragmentary records from multiple ancient cultures, was considered to be a guardian. A protector." The silence in the room was absolute. "A protector of what?" Voss asked. Dr. Okafor looked at her datapad. "That's what we're still trying to determine," she said. "But Krath has drawn 17 more symbols since the first one. And Sergeant Hale believes it is trying to tell us something specific. Something urgent." Every head in the room turned toward Daniel. He was sitting at the end of the table, his notes in front of him, looking tired in the way he always looked tired. Like a man who had been working hard for a long time and had no intention of stopping. "I think it's a warning," Daniel said. "I think it's been trying to give us a warning since the day it was brought aboard, and I think the reason it destroyed everything we sent at it was because we kept sending things that couldn't listen." Another silence. "A warning about what?" Voss asked. Daniel looked at his notes. Then he looked up. "Something is coming," he said. "Something that Krath has seen before. Something that the ancient civilizations knew about and tried to prepare for, and I think Krath was on that moon for a reason. I think it was waiting, not to be captured, to be found." The room was very still. Outside, in the dark between stars, the Vanguard Eternal moved through space that suddenly felt much less empty than it had before. The warning came into focus over the next 72 hours. Daniel worked with Krath almost continuously, sleeping in short intervals on the cot that had been moved into the observation room adjacent to the containment bay. He ate when Dr. Okafor brought him food and reminded him that he needed to. He barely noticed the passage of time. The symbols multiplied. Krath drew them on every available surface of the containment bay, building what the linguistics team eventually recognized as a map. Not a map of space, exactly. A map of something older than space as the Coalition understood it. A map of a pattern. A cycle. Something had happened before. Long ago, before any of the current civilizations existed, before the coalition, before the wars and the treaties and the expansion into the outer systems. Something had come through this region of the galaxy and destroyed everything in its path. Not a species. Not an army. Something else. Something that the ancient records, fragmentary and incomplete as they were, described only in terms of absence. A darkness that consumed. A silence that spread. The ancient civilizations had known it was coming. They had prepared. And the Guardians, the species that Krath belonged to, had been their first line of defense. They had stopped it. At enormous cost. The records suggested that the Guardian species had been nearly wiped out in the process. What remained had scattered. Gone into hiding. Gone into waiting. Waiting for the cycle to turn again. Waiting for it to come back. Because it always came back. Daniel sat with Krath on the last night of the 72 hours and looked at the map that covered the walls of the containment bay. He looked at the symbols he had learned to read. Imperfectly, incompletely. But enough. He looked at the pattern that the linguistics team had finally decoded. The cycle was not abstract. It had a timeline. And according to the map on the wall, the timeline was very specific. He looked at Krath. "How long?" he asked. Krath looked at him. Then it drew one more symbol on the floor between them. Simple. Clear. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to find Commander Voss. The meeting that followed lasted 4 hours. Every senior officer on the ship was present. The linguistics team presented their full analysis. Dr. Okafor presented the biological data. And Daniel presented what he had learned from Krath, translated as accurately as he could manage, with all the appropriate caveats about the limitations of his understanding. The conclusion was this: something was coming. It would arrive in this region of space within a time frame that was short enough to matter and long enough to prepare. And the only reason they knew about it, the only reason they had any warning at all, was because a medic had walked into a room without a weapon and listened. Commander Voss sat at the head of the table for a long time after the presentations were finished. He looked at the data. He looked at the map images. He looked at Daniel. "What does Krath need from us?" he asked. It was the right question. Daniel had been waiting for someone to ask it. "Freedom," Daniel said. "Not to leave. To move. To do what it was built to do. It can't protect anything from inside a containment bay." Voss was quiet. "And it needs us to trust it," Daniel continued. "The same way it trusted me. The same way it trusted that I wasn't going to hurt it when I walked in that first day. We have to make the same choice." The silence in the room was different from all the previous silences. It was not the silence of fear or disbelief. It was the silence of people standing at the edge of a decision that they knew would change everything. Voss looked around the table. He looked at each face. Then he looked at Daniel. "All right," he said. "Open the bay." The containment barriers came down at 0300 hours ship time, when most of the crew was asleep. Daniel was there. Dr. Okafor was there. Torres was there, because he had asked to be, and nobody had the heart to say no. The door opened. Krath walked out. It moved slowly, deliberately, its massive body filling the corridor in a way that should have been terrifying and somehow was not. It stopped when it reached Daniel. It lowered its head. Daniel placed his hand on the side of its face. Just for a moment, the way you would with any patient you were saying goodbye to. Or not goodbye, but something like it. "Go do what you need to do," Daniel said. Krath looked at him with those deep red eyes. Then it moved forward, toward the upper decks, toward the hull, toward the stars. What happened next is the part of the story that is hardest to tell. Not because it is unclear, but because it is the kind of thing that sounds impossible until you have seen it. Until you have stood on the observation deck of a ship in deep space and watched a creature older than civilization itself move through the dark like it was born there, which it was, and take up a position that it had been waiting thousands of years to take. The crew of the Vanguard Eternal watched from every viewport and camera feed. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Krath was exactly where it was supposed to be. And the galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, had a guardian again. Here is the part of the story that almost nobody knows. 3 months after the events on the Vanguard Eternal, a coalition research team reviewing ancient records from the Draconis sector found something that had been overlooked in the initial analysis. A secondary set of symbols, smaller and less prominent than the main map, inscribed on the walls of the ancient structure where Krath had been found. The linguistics team spent weeks decoding them. When they finally did, the lead researcher sent a single message to Dr. Okafor that read, "You need to see this." The secondary symbols were not part of the warning. They were older than the warning. They were instructions, left by the ancient civilizations for whoever came after them, for whoever found the guardian and had the wisdom to listen instead of fight. The instructions described exactly what had happened on the Vanguard Eternal, not as a prediction, as a record. As if someone, thousands of years ago, had known that this moment would come, had known that a guardian would be found, and that the key to reaching it would not be weapons or technology or force. It would be kindness. It would be a person who walked in without armor and asked if something was in pain. The ancient record had a name for this person. Not a specific name, not a prophecy about one individual, a title, a role. In the oldest language the linguistics team had ever encountered, the translation was approximate but clear. The healer who opens the door. Daniel Hale never sought recognition for what he did. He went back to his work in the medical bay. He treated patients. He kept people alive. He did his job the way he had always done it, quietly and consistently and without any need for applause. But the galaxy remembered. And somewhere in the dark between stars, a guardian older than civilization moved through the void, doing what it had always been meant to do, because one ordinary man had chosen to listen instead of fight. That is the truth they almost buried. That is the story nobody talks about. And it started with a medic who walked into a room and asked a simple question. Do you need help? If this opened your eyes to what one person can do when they choose compassion over fear, then this story was worth telling. Here is what this story really taught us. The most powerful force in the galaxy was not a weapon. It was not an army. It was not technology, or strategy, or firepower. It was a man who walked into the most dangerous room in the universe and chose to listen. Krath was not tamed by strength. It was reached by kindness. And the warning that saved the galaxy was only heard because one person was willing to ask if something was in pain. That is the first takeaway. Compassion is not weakness. In the right moment, it is the most powerful thing in existence. The second takeaway is this. The things we fear most are often the things that need help the most. Krath destroyed everything that came at it with aggression, because aggression was all it had ever received. The moment someone offered something different, everything changed. That is true in the galaxy. It is true in this world too. And the third takeaway. The most important stories are the ones nobody talks about. The quiet ones. The ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things not because they were trying to be heroes, but because it was simply the right thing to do. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Genuinely. This story matters to me, and I hope it matters to you too. If it did, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel more than you know. And if you want more stories like this, stories about humans doing the impossible in a universe that underestimates them, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. Here is my question for you, and I want you to answer it in the comments. If you were on the Vanguard Eternal that day, would you have volunteered to go into that room? Tell me honestly. I read every single comment. And if you want to go deeper, the next video is already waiting for you. It is another Hafey story that will hit even harder than this one. A story about a human prisoner who became the most feared negotiator in the galaxy. Click it now. I promise you will not regret it. The galaxy is full of stories they do not want you to hear. We are just getting started.